Good evening, everyone. This is Eric Jessen, president of the Ruskin Art Club, and on behalf of the board of directors, welcome to tonight's presentation, Out of the Abyss, John Ruskin, Jack London, and Social Reform by Sara, Hodson. To introduce Sara and moderate this evening's proceedings, we're delighted to welcome back our old friend, Professor Jim Spates, Emeritus Professor of Sociology at Hobart William Smith Colleges in Geneva, New York. And on a personal note, I've been to Geneva and the college, and both are beautiful. Take it away, Jim.
Thank you very much, Eric. Very kind. Glad to take it away. A special evening. Delighted to be here again and talking to the people who tune into these Ruskin Art Club events. It is my great pleasure to be able to introduce Sara S. Sue Hodson, who is a dear friend. She is the retired curator of literary manuscripts for the Huntington Library, right near most of you, where she oversaw all of the British and American literary manuscripts from the Renaissance to the present. She speaks often and writes often on a variety of literary subjects and on the issue of privacy in modern manuscript collections. She is the co-writer of Jack London, Photographer, a book published in 2010. She contributed an essay quotes The People of the Abyss, Tensions and Tenements in the Capital of Poverty to the Oxford Handbook on Jack London, and she will edit one volume in the forthcoming Oxford edition of the works of Jack London. Her current project is an edition of the Korean War Letters of Al Martinez, the award-winning featured columnist for the Los Angeles Times. Her honors include being named a Fellow of the Society of American Archivists and Woman of the Year by the Jack London Foundation in 2012. Now, at this point, if I were a good moderator, I would certainly just turn it over to Sue for her talk, but I'm going to take a personal moment. About 5 or 6 years ago, maybe it was 7, I first went to the Huntington to read the Ruskin manuscripts that they have there. They've kept there for decades and decades. They're one of the great Ruskin manuscript and letter repositories in the world. And while I was there, I happened to meet Sue. We had a nice chat, and I said, well, have you folks ever had a conference on Ruskin? She said, yes, we had one, but it was about 30 years ago. And I said, 30 years ago? It might not be time for another. She said, I don't know, but I'll talk to various people. And over the course of the next couple of years, she did talk to various people. And as many of you who are Zooming in tonight know, we had a major Ruskin conference at the Huntington in 2019, just before the pandemic began. And I have to say, and I know I say for all of us who were at that conference, that it went spectacularly well. And it would not have happened if Sue Hodson had not been in our camp and has essentially championed us in having a major presentation at the Huntington, which remains a major repository, as I said earlier, of Ruskiniana and places where you can find wonderful amounts of his letters and manuscripts. So Sue and I have become good friends over the years, and I'm delighted to be asked to be moderator for her presentation tonight. The title of her talk is Out of the Abyss, and the subtitle is John Ruskin, Jack London, and Social Reform. Social Reform, sorry. So I'll now turn it over to Sue. We are most anxious to hear what you have to say on this wonderful topic. Sue, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Jim. It's a great pleasure for me to be here with you this evening. And I can't say enough about Jim and what a mentor he's been for me with John Ruskin. I didn't see how the Huntington could fail to host a conference about Ruskin, given the holdings that the library has. And it turned out to be, I think, one of the finest conferences ever presented at the Huntington. So that was a great joy. And that kind of began to launch me on reading and trying to understand John Ruskin. And I will say that I am very grateful to Jim for his 3 lectures earlier, well, late last year, about Unto This Last, which those essays contain so much of what Ruskin wrote about social reform. And Jim's wisdom in reading those and enlightening the rest of us who were along for the ride did so much, because I had read those essays, and after Jim's series of lectures, I read them again and I got so much more out of them. So Jim, I can't thank you enough for that. And Gabriel, I want to thank you very much for this opportunity. You and Katrina and everyone connected with the Ruskin Art Club have been fabulous to work with, keeping me as technologically savvy as I'm ever going to be and ensuring that this all runs smoothly. So thank you so much. So with no further ado, we'll get started with John Ruskin, Jack London, and social reform. John Ruskin and Jack London. These might well be two names you would never expect to see in the same sentence. But as I hope to demonstrate, despite profound and strong differences between them, the two shared many of the same views and concerns about social reform. At first blush, one might not expect social reform to be a focus by either author. John Ruskin is, of course, best known as an art critic, but in the 1850s, and especially by about 1860, roughly halfway through his lifetime, he began to focus on social reform. As for Jack London, famous for his robust tales of adventure, social issues were never far from his thoughts and writings. In sometimes similar and sometimes differing ways, both men felt great concern for the plight of the poor, and both held deep convictions about political economy, specifically capitalism, and about what should be done to alleviate the soulless nature of common labor and to lift people up from the dire straits of poverty. Both men wrote extensively about the social ills they saw around them and about how these ills might be cured or at least relieved. And both supported their words with actions performed on behalf of those who needed help. First, a brief word about London's biography and how his life differed profoundly from Ruskin's. While Ruskin lived an early life of familial security and financial stability with a father who was an importer of wine and sherry, London's origins were quite the opposite. He was born as John Griffith Cheney in San Francisco, the illegitimate son of Flora Wellman, a music teacher and spiritualist, and William Henry Cheney, an itinerant astrologer. His mother tried unsuccessfully to abort him, and his father later denied that he was London's father. London acquired his name and a family life when Flora married John London, a Civil War veteran and struggling farmer. On the other hand, Ruskin received a fine education via home tutoring and schools that included King's College, London, and Oxford University. Young Jack, on the other hand, had to drop out of school in the 4th grade in order to help feed the family, taking up the first of a long series of unskilled jobs that included setting pins in a bowling alley, selling newspapers, and working in a cannery, a jute mill, and a hotel laundry. He went on to pirate the oyster beds of the bay, then sailed as a cabin boy on a sealing schooner. And when he deemed that none of these dead-end jobs would yield a decent life, he tramped and hopped boxcars across country with other hobos. In contrast, Ruskin traveled extensively on the continent, absorbing the cultural offerings and steeping himself in art. He made art his life's work, attaining fame as a critic and philosopher. London, determined to become a writer against enormous odds, scribbled furiously at night after working long, exhausting hours of menial labor. In a final effort to make money with his hands, London headed for the Yukon when the cry of gold became a siren call in 1898. Finding no gold, but acquiring instead rich nuggets of Klondike stories, he returned home and renewed his writing efforts. After attaining impressive stacks of rejection slips, he found success and fame through his robust tales of the Klondike. By 1903, his novel, The Call of the Wilde, established him as a serious writer and enabled him to make a handsome living from his writing. Always an overachiever, London was not only a writer, but also an adventurer, rancher, journalist, war correspondent, photojournalist, lecturer, traveler, and sailor. By the time he died at the age of 40, he had notched several lifetimes of accomplishments. From these brief sketches, the most basic differences between Ruskin and London are obvious. Ruskin came from a background of comfort and financial security, while London suffered the disadvantages of poverty, often going hungry and forced into child labor. Their childhood experiences exerted strong effects on both. As writers, they also could hardly be more disparate. When Ruskin examined the finer aesthetics of art, London produced muscular tales of adventure. But let us look at some of the qualities they shared. Both were very well known during and after their lifetimes and held positions of stature among their readers and the public at large. Ruskin sought to shape the artistic thinking of his generation and became the inspiration and mentor of the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, the artists who looked to the past for the artistic purity they sought in their own work. His artistic views and his vision of a better England also heavily influenced William Morris, the heir to the pre-Raphaelites and the primary force behind the arts and crafts movement. Ruskin's influence was even more extensive than that, however. The biographer John Batchelor notes that in a 1906 survey asking which authors or books had most influenced their beliefs, the Labour members of the House of Commons placed Ruskin at the top of the list, followed in order by the Bible, Charles Dickens, Henry George, Thomas Carlyle, John Stuart Mill, Walter Scott, Shakespeare, and John Bunyan. Beyond that, Mohandas Gandhi, as a young man in 1894, admired unto this last so highly that he, quote, determined to change my life in accordance with the ideals of the book. For his part, here they are. For his part, Jack London hit the reading public both in America and abroad like a bolt of lightning. His tales of adventure, published in magazines and literary journals, utterly eclipsed the sometimes limp and bloodless stories of the day, inspiring readers to demand more from the pens of London and other new writers. London was one of the first, if not the first, American author to write in the naturalistic vein, something that brought realism and the rougher sides of life to the forefront of readers' attention. For many readers, there would be no looking back. London was one of the first to recognize and capitalize on the power of celebrity, and he knew that publicity about him and his exploits would attract more readers, sell more books, and generate more income. Thus, his adventuring made headlines around the world and brought thick wads of clippings to his mailbox every day, sent by several clipping bureaus. London's wife, Charmian, applied her scissors and paste pot, and now the clippings fill 27 giant ledger volumes in the London papers housed at the Huntington. Both writers were extremely prolific. Ruskin's collected works fill some 39 magnificent volumes of the library edition published from 1903 to 1912. And here you see part of those 39 volumes in the library edition. London published an astonishing 50 books in his short life of 40 years, and Oxford University Press, as you've heard, will soon begin to issue his complete works in a 35-volume edition. Such comparisons between these two authors are intriguing, but why would we think there could have been any link between them? To examine this, let's follow a thread from Jack London leading back in time. Among the several thousand books that London owned, we find Oscar Wilde's short book, The Soul of Man Under Socialism. London read this work, and the extent of his annotations in the book attests to how deeply Wilde's views resonated with him. Moreover, London used a passage from the book as an epigram for a chapter in The People of the Abyss, his nonfiction study of the poor in the East End of London in 1902. More about that later. With the London-Wilde connection in mind, we note that Wilde, during his years at Oxford University, attended Ruskin's lectures, took long walks with him, and participated with other undergraduates in Ruskin's famous project to improve the road at Ferry Hinksey. More on this enterprise later. Most importantly, Wilde looked up to Ruskin as a mentor. The strength and depth of their bond are expressed in a letter Wilde wrote to Ruskin, where he said, quote, "The dearest memories of my Oxford days are my walks and talks with you, and from you I learned nothing but what is good. How else could it be? There is in you something of prophet, of priest, and of poet, and to you the gods gave eloquence such as they have given to none other, so that your message might come to us with the fire of passion and the marvel of music, making the deaf to hear and the blind to see," unquote. Knowing that London found a kindred soul in Oscar Wilde, and that in turn, Wilde saw Ruskin as a mentor, is it possible that some of Ruskin's views filtered through Wilde and influenced London? As we will see shortly, London greatly admired Wilde's view on socialism and social reform. But did London absorb Ruskin's views directly? We know that London read Ruskin's works and thus could well have been directly influenced by him. London owned a multi-volume set of Ruskin, and given his habit of reading everything he could get his hands on, especially the major thinkers of the 19th century, we may feel sure he did indeed read Ruskin. However, there are no annotations in his Ruskin volumes, but this is not definitive. London annotated many, but not nearly all of the books in his library. So the lack of markings cannot be taken as firm evidence of anything. My own guess is that much of what he read resonated with him, but that a significant proportion met with his disagreement. One thing we may be sure about: the dense thickets of Ruskin's prose would not have put London off. The more difficult and demanding a book was, the better he liked it. His own correspondence demonstrates that he was quite familiar with the critic's writings. Following a letter in which he discusses political economy, the editors of the collected letters of Jack London indicate in an endnote that London began his reading of Marx, Ruskin, William Morris, and other writers on politics and economics when he joined the Henry Clay Club, a debating society for high school boys that existed from 1891 to 1896. At that point, London was a teenager of newly formed and passionate beliefs about social reform and with a keen interest in socialism. There are two letters in which London refers to Ruskin directly. In 1899, in a letter to his best friend, Cloudsley Johns, London holds forth on the superiority of nonfiction to novels for effecting changes in society or public opinion. After citing Herbert Spencer's First Principles as his exemplar for improving mankind, London goes on, and you see the quote before you, quote, "Why, take the enormous power for human good contained in Darwin's Origin of Species and Descent of Man, or in the work of Ruskin, Mill, Huxley, Carlyle, Ingersoll," unquote. A year later, in 1900, writing again to Cloudsley Johns, the person with whom London most enjoyed intellectual tussles, he revealed his awareness of contemporary literary news when he refers to the interrupted publication of the essays that would become Unto This Last. He wrote, quote, "Ruskin, at the height of his fame and turning out his best work in the Cornhill, had the series of essays stopped in the middle by Thackeray, the editor, because they were daring. And daring, mark you, not for their attacks on religion, but for their attacks on the prevailing school of political economy," unquote. One final piece of biographical data linking London and Ruskin: London was a charter member of the Ruskin Club of Oakland, co-founded by his friend Frederick Irons Bamford, and London spoke there on at least one occasion. With this background for our two authors, let us examine their actions and their writings relating to social reform and attempt to determine whether there really is a link between them. If we accept that the term social reform, at its most basic, refers to the general improvement of human life and the relief or elimination of its defects, then the evidence presented by the actions and writings of both Ruskin and London shows that each held a deep, passionate conviction of the need for such reform. Ruskin, of course, was known primarily as an art critic, but his interests and expertise extended far more widely. As we have noted, his writings shifted from a concentration on art to an emphasis on social issues. But in considering social issues, the influence of art was never far from Ruskin's thinking. As J.A. Hodson points out in his book, John Ruskin, Social Reformer, the path of Ruskin's thought and works progressed from nature to art, then through art to human life, toward the, quote, making and governing of human society founded on principles of justice and humanity, unquote. The degree to which art infuses all of life and contributes to its betterment, and beyond that, the extent to which this is crucial to humanity for Ruskin, are made clear in modern painters, where Ruskin writes, quote, all art which involves no reference to man is inferior or nugatory, and all art which involves misconception of man or base thought of him is in that degree false and base. The difference between great and mean art lies wholly in the nobleness of the end to which the effort of the painter is addressed, unquote. Thus, the root of Ruskin's theory of art is its service to humanity through the presentation of noble ideas. His belief in the dignity of the common man formed a fundamental part of his social beliefs. Jack London, in contrast, came to his views on social reform directly and personally, having grown up in the lower class and having known what it is to be hungry and to have no prospects for improving one's lot in life. For a while, he harbored a keen ambition to rise to the upper classes, the ruling classes. However, after meeting socialists and revolutionaries whose views agreed with and inspired his own, he developed a belief in the nobility of the common man that Ruskin espoused. Throwing his lot in with theirs, London turned his back on his ambitions for upward mobility, recognizing that in the common people around him lay the fundamental dignity of spirit he sought. In his essay, What Life Means to Me, he wrote, quote, here I found also warm faith in the human, glowing idealism, sweetnesses of unselfishness, renunciation, and martyrdom, all the splendid, stinging things of the spirit. Here life was clean, noble, and alive. Here life rehabilitated itself, became wonderful and glorious, and I was glad to be alive. I was in touch with great souls who exalted flesh and spirit over dollars and cents, and to whom the thin wail of the starved slum child meant more than all the pomp and circumstance of commercial expansion and world empire. All about me were nobleness of purpose and heroism of effort, and my days and nights were sunshine and starshine, all fire and dew, with before my eyes, ever burning and blazing, the Holy Grail, Christ's own Grail, the warm, human, long-suffering and maltreated, but to be rescued and saved at the last, unquote. With these underpinnings to their beliefs in social reform, Ruskin and London both pursued activities intended to draw attention to and alleviate the want and suffering of humanity, and to instill dignity in the lives of those at the bottom of the social scale. Ruskin embarked on several projects to improve the lives of the poor and to enrich their spirits as well. One of his best known efforts was the 1874 reconstruction of a road in a village called Ferry Hinksey near Oxford. Noting the swampy lane in which pedestrians and horse carts were constantly mired in mud, he determined to set a gang of Oxford undergraduates, including Oscar Wilde, who had the privilege of wielding Ruskin's very own wheelbarrow, to the task of building a new flower-lined road that would afford a beautiful prospect, as well as improving the travel route for the village residents. As a bonus of the project, the young men would apply their muscles to hard labor while also experiencing service to those in need. Contemporaries derived much humor from the seemingly quixotic enterprise, but there was a legitimate reason to improve the road. Henry Ackland, the Regius Professor of Medicine at Oxford and holding an interest in Ruskin's views, had studied the prevalence of cholera in the Oxford area and his book on the subject identified Ferry Hinksey as a location of significant outbreaks of the disease, mostly due to the swampiness and the dampness. So eliminating that swampiness in the village served a public health purpose as well as an aesthetic one. Also in 1874, Ruskin launched a more direct endeavor to aid the poor when he opened a tea shop on Paddington Street in London. Tea, the perennial staple of British life, would be sold to the poor in quantities small enough to be affordable by those with very little cash at hand. The shop was operated by 2 retired servants from the Ruskin family, and making a profit was not part of the equation. Located in an unappealing site with little foot traffic, however, the business languished. One of the shopkeepers died, and by 1876, the shop was closed. The tale of the tea shop links to another of Ruskin's projects to help the poor. The shop on Paddington Street occupied one of his properties that was managed by social reform crusader Octavia Hill, whose dates are 1838 to 1912. After the shop was closed, she converted the space to more housing for the working classes. Committed to improving housing for the poor, Hill, who was described as, quote, determined and tiresome, unquote, by Ruskin biographer Tim Hilton, had enlisted Ruskin several years earlier to establish housing in properties in Marylebone that had been owned by Ruskin's father. As a humanitarian, Ruskin was affronted by the squalor of these homes, and as an artist, he deplored their ugly, dispiriting appearance. Together, Hill and Ruskin had repaired and upgraded the homes, and they had established affordable homes overseen by kind landlords who cared for the tenants and provided housing security. His financial support and her managerial work meshed well until they had a falling out, apparently brought on by each speaking openly and critically of the other. Ruskin's sense of aesthetics and his concern for the spiritual lives of the underclasses impelled him to join the Working Men's College, which was established in 1854 by Charles Kingsley, Frederick J. Furnivall, and others, with the purpose of offering workmen who could not take advantage of formal higher education the chance to take evening classes in the best academic training. One of the founders, Frederick Denison Maurice, wrote that he had never doubted, quote, that the whole country must look for its blessings through the elevation of its working class, that we must all sink if that is not raised. We could not talk to suffering men of intellectual or moral improvement without first taking an interest in their physical condition and their ordinary occupations, unquote. Ruskin began teaching a regular class in drawing, continuing between 1854 and 1858, and again in 1860. His stated goal was not, quote, to make a carpenter an artist, but to make him happier as a carpenter, unquote. He was very popular with his students, one of whom noted, quote, how generous he was. He taught each of us separately, studying the capacities of each student, unquote. An independent observer, the pre-Raphaelite painter Ford Madox Brown, who visited the college occasionally, reported that, quote, Ruskin was as eloquent as ever and wildly popular with the men, unquote. Another much larger project that melded Ruskin's humanitarian and aesthetic concerns is the Guild of St. George. Founded in 1871 as St. George's Company, the Guild is, as you all know, still in operation. The Guild joined medieval, that is pre-industrial values with a commitment to social improvement. Ruskin sought to establish communities that would turn away from industrialization with its mass production and obsession with profits. J.A. Hodson, in his book, John Ruskin's Social Reformer, elaborates on the goals of the Guild, quote, to raise a fund in order to buy some land, which should be cultivated by manual labor with as little water-driven machinery as possible, worked thoroughly so as to bear the fullest increase, the laborers to be paid fixed and sufficient wages to live in cottages of their own, with sound education for their children upon Ruskinian lines, and every opportunity of wholesome recreation for themselves, was the scheme as it took early shape, unquote. Toward these goals, the Guild, using donations from Ruskin and other supporters, acquired various parcels of land so that people could live in sound health, surrounded by the ennobling beauty of nature, which would promote responsible personal conduct and would keep the workers from the poverty of body and soul that would be found in industrial cities. Ruskin also established St. George's Museum in 1875 in Sheffield for the working men of the city and its surrounding areas. In contrast to Ruskin, London worked on behalf of the poor from a much more direct personal standing, partly because of his own background. His major project relating to poverty and its relief was the period of 7 weeks he spent living among the poor and the homeless in the East End of London, England. He had long wanted to live for a time in the slums of one of the great cities of the world. His descent into the East End enabled him to attain this goal. In one sense, London's nonfiction account of this descent, entitled The People of the Abyss, is one in a long line of books written about life in the slums, including Henry Mayhew's London Labor and the London Poor, 1861-2, George Hawes' No Room to Live, The Plaint of Overcrowded London, 1902, Robert Blatchford's Dismal England, 1902, and Jacob Riis's The Battle with the Slums, also 1902. However, London's book stands apart from the rest because it is deeply personal and it is based on his own direct experience in the East End. While Riis and the others walked through the slums and observed the people and their living conditions, London actually lived among the poor as one of them, experiencing nearly every facet of their daily lives. In order to pass as one of the poor, London bought a suit of used clothes at a pawn shop, posing as a sailor stuck in port and down on his luck. Wearing this clothing, he noted a profound difference in the way he fit in with those around him. He describes it this way, quote, "No sooner was I out on the streets than I was impressed by the difference in status effected by my clothes. All servility vanished from the demeanor of the common people with whom I came in contact. Presto, in the twinkling of an eye, so to say, I had become one of them. My frayed and out-at-elbows jacket was the badge and advertisement of my class, which was their class. It made me of like kind, and in place of the fawning and too respectful attention I had hitherto received, I now shared with them a comradeship," unquote. It is clear that in writing his book, London intended his study to alarm his readers and thereby impel them to press for action in order to end the tragic effects of poverty and homelessness. Again and again, London relates poignant, shocking incidents and scenarios that he gleans from his direct encounters and experiences with individuals. One biographer accused London of writing with too much passion, producing, quote, overwrought propaganda, unquote, rather than philosophy or objective description. However, London's passionate account of life in the East End is entirely by design. He knows that by focusing on specific people and their troubles, he can reach his readers personally and viscerally, and that he is more likely to sway their views than if he were more dispassionate. In telling the stories of specific people, London makes their situations breathe with horrifying life, their unnerving images unforgettable for the reader. London asks, is the picture overdrawn? It all depends. For one who sees and thinks of life in terms of shares and coupons, it is entirely overdrawn. But for one who sees and thinks of life in terms of manhood and womanhood, it cannot be overdrawn, unquote. To persuade his readers to act in remediation of poverty, London employs powerful language and imagery in describing the people around him. Many of the people are so degraded by poverty, they have become bestial, and London recoils from them in revulsion and disgust. In his words, they are rendered subhuman. They are hordes of beastly wretchedness who eat ravenously of the swill, a menagerie of garmented bipeds that look something like humans and more like beasts, and they snarled too fiercely. They are ravenous gutter wolves. They remind him of gorillas, and they crawl out of their dens and lairs, shambling like apes. However, London perceives that these repellent people did not choose to become so. Rather, they have been subjected to the dehumanizing forces exerted upon them by society. And London advises his readers not to judge the EastEnders too harshly, but to understand that they have been degraded by poverty. He offers vignettes that attest to the underlying humanity of many of the poor, as in this example. Standing in line at the entrance to the Whitechapel workhouse, London notices an older couple also waiting in line. They present a proud and sober appearance and talk of making their lives as hop pickers. He observes that the woman is, quote, fairly clad, unquote, and he watches a brief byplay between the two. Quote, as she talked to him, he reached forward, caught the one stray wisp of white hair that was flying wild, deftly twirled it between his fingers and tucked it back properly behind her ear, unquote. Here, London is not at all reluctant to tug at his readers' heartstrings in order to sway their emotions toward relief for the poor. From the foregoing, we see that both London and Ruskin embraced humanitarian concerns for the poor through their actions, albeit in very different ways. Let us now examine their writings to understand more about their views and to investigate Ruskin's possible influence on London. Ruskin touched on social issues in many of his works, but two of his works dealt with these matters deeply and at length. Unto This Last in 1860, issued as a book in 1862, and you see its absolutely stunning title page here, and also his other work, Fors Clavigera, from 1871 to 1884. London voiced his reform concerns in The People of the Abyss, 1902, along with the fruits of his experiences and encounters with the EastEnders that we have already sampled, and he wrote about social issues in a number of other works. Both Ruskin and London perceived poverty as a dehumanizing force that crushed human beings, making them live like animals for survival alone. They enunciated their views in visceral, remarkably similar words. In Ad Valorem, the fourth essay in Unto This Last, Ruskin asserts that, quote, it is not meat of which the refusal is cruelest or to which the claim is validest. The life is more than the meat. Meat, perhaps your right to that may be pleadable, but other rights have to be pleaded first. Claim your right to be fed, but claim more loudly your right to be holy, perfect, and pure, unquote. Very much in the same vein, London writes in What Life Means to Me, quote, I look forward to a time when man shall progress upon something worthier and higher than his stomach, when there will be a finer incentive to impel men to action than the incentive of today, which is the incentive of the stomach, unquote. We also recall London's letter to Mabel Applegarth, dated November 30th, 1898, in which he recounts this story from his 7th year. Quote, meat, I was that hungry for it. I once opened a girl's basket and stole a piece of meat, a little piece the size of my 2 fingers. In those days, like Esau, I would have literally sold my birthright for a mess of pottage, a piece of meat, unquote. His point, of course, is that forced to live for mere survival, he is driven by his stomach, by his acute need for meat, rather than being inspired by nobler aspirations. London and Ruskin both address the matter of alms for the poor, and again, they write in accord. Jack London in The People of the Abyss writes approvingly of the unemployed tramp, quote, he knows that 2 shillings a day, which is only 50 cents, will buy him 3 fair meals, a bed at night, and leave him a couple of pennies for pocket money. He would rather work for those 2 shillings than for the charity of the casual ward, for he knows that he would not have to work so hard and that he would not be so abominably treated, unquote. In Unto This Last, Ruskin writes, quote, the mistake of the best men through generation after generation has been that great one of thinking to help the poor by almsgiving and by preaching of patience or of hope, unquote. Here, when Ruskin addresses the mistaken belief that the poor should be patient with their lot in life, we think of London writing in The People of the Abyss of his admiration for what he called the disobedient poor, the people he called rebels, who are discontented and ungrateful for the alms thrust at them, alms that dehumanize the poor and that always come with unreasonable demands made upon the recipients. One rebel London greatly admired and who appears in The People of the Abyss is Dan Cullen, who, quote, did not cringe to other men, even though they were his economic masters and controlled the means whereby he lived, and he spoke his mind freely and fought the good fight, unquote. Both Ruskin and London, in expressing these views, agree with Oscar Wilde, whose words in The Soul of Man Under Socialism, London used as an epigram for chapter 26 of The People of the Abyss, and you see it here. Wilde wrote, quote, sometimes the poor are praised for being thrifty, but to recommend thrift to the poor is both grotesque and insulting. It is like advising a man who is starving to eat less. For a town or country laborer to practice thrift would be absolutely immoral. Man should not be ready to show that he can live like a badly fed animal, unquote. For all three writers, the poor should not have to grovel to their so-called betters, be grateful for alms, or be forced to make do with less. Sharing this view that all people deserve a better life than the mere struggle for survival, both Ruskin and London focus on the common workers and enunciate the virtues of satisfaction in labor. Ruskin abhorred the industrialization that he saw on all sides in Victorian England, deploring industrial goods and, in the nature of Gothic, excoriating, quote, the precision of mass production, unquote, that forced workers to be cog wheels. For Ruskin, the mechanized work life described here stultifies man's soul. He writes, quote, to feel their souls withering within them, unthanked, to find their whole being sunk into an unrecognized abyss. And note here his use of London's word, abyss, to be counted off into a heap of mechanism, numbered with its wheels and weighed with its hammer strokes. This nature bad not, this God blesses not, this humanity for no long time is able to endure, unquote. This view reminds us of London's frequent lament about men forced to be work beasts, working at poorly paid, unfulfilling labor that was spirit crushing and soul deadening, and that kept them at the bottom strata of society with no chance for upward mobility to improve their lives. When Ruskin notes that, quote, the laborer must be happy, the work must be good. Once forming the resolution that your work is to be well done, life is really won, here and forever, unquote. We know that this accords with London's view that there must be more in life than functioning merely as a work beast. London and Ruskin differ in the fundamental basis for their views of menial mechanized labor. Ruskin looked to the past, specifically to medieval times, for the approach to labor that would recognize workers' abilities and offer them the psychic benefits derived from rewarding work. The ideal society envisioned by Ruskin would comprise an organization of labor, much like the ancient guilds, which he saw as including both masters and workers in every kind of manufacture, agriculture, and art. Workers should be allowed to imagine and to think, and he asserted that when the engine-turned precision of factory-made goods is lost, quote, the whole majesty, unquote, of the worker is found. Thus, while we know of Ruskin's efforts to alleviate poverty, his concern for the psychic rewards of labor is even more strongly based on his artistic philosophy. In contrast, London focuses wholly and specifically on the poor and their entrapment in the lowest kinds of menial labor, which never offers a living wage and from which they can never hope to escape. Ruskin is setting forth a way of life that enfolds art and beauty, fostered by medieval-style guilds, even as it benefits the poor. Jack London comes to his similar conclusion by a different route, leading from his direct experience as a work beast when he writes that, quote, man cannot be worked worse than a horse is worked, and be housed and fed as a pig is housed and fed, and at the same time have clean and wholesome ideals and aspirations, unquote. A key difference between Ruskin and London in this and other beliefs is that Ruskin believed in natural and necessary hierarchy in society. The poor, rather than seeking to rise above their class, must remain in their prescribed place, but that place must be made whole, satisfying, and rewarding to them. London would not have agreed that hierarchy is desirable or necessary, but he did believe that all people, especially the poor, deserved to be able to live lives of dignity with their physical and psychic needs met. London was an avowed socialist who gave up his hope for upward mobility to embrace his comrades in the working class. The turning point came for him when he spent some months as a hobo, tramping across the nation and filling his eyes and soul with direct life experiences that did much to shape his beliefs and that inspired him to turn to socialism. In his memoir, John Barleycorn, he writes, quote, "As a tramp, I was behind the scenes of society, and down in the cellar. I could watch the machinery work. I saw the wheels of the social machine go around, and I learned that the dignity of manual labor wasn't what I had been told it was by the teachers, preachers, and politicians. The men without trades were helpless cattle," unquote. In his essay, What Socialism Is, London provides his definition, quote, "Socialism means a reconstruction of society with a more just application of labor and distribution of the returns thereof. It cries out, everyone according to his deeds. Its logical foundation is economic. Its moral foundation, all men are born free and equal, and its ultimate aim is pure democracy," unquote. Setting aside Ruskin's avowed conviction of the need for hierarchy in society, this statement by London could well refer to many of Ruskin's beliefs. We may say with confidence that Ruskin and London both rejected laissez-faire capitalism and embraced a different view of political economy. Both believed that value lay not in monetary wealth, but in the better, purer things in life. You will recall that earlier we noted London's words about his hope for the future. Quote, "I look forward to a time when man shall progress upon something worthier and higher than his stomach, when there will be a finer incentive to impel men to action than the incentive of today, which is the incentive of the stomach." Well, London goes on, he continues to say, "I retain my belief in the nobility and excellence of the human. I believe that spiritual sweetness and unselfishness will conquer the gross gluttony of today," unquote. It seems to me that this is but another way of expressing Ruskin's well-known life-affirming statement, quote, "There is no wealth but life. Life, including all its powers of love, of joy, and of admiration. That country is the richest, which nourishes the greatest number of noble and happy human beings. That man is richest who, having perfected the functions of his own life to the utmost, has also the widest helpful influence, both personal and by means of his possessions, over the lives of others," unquote. London, like Ruskin, knew that, in Ruskin's words, to be valuable is to avail towards life. Having taken this deep dive into Jack London's and John Ruskin's philosophies of social reform, we know that London definitely read Ruskin, although with what degree of interest and agreement, we cannot say with certainty. Looking at the link from London to Oscar Wilde, and then from Wilde to Ruskin, we can see strong agreement concerning poverty, especially in their disapproval of the doling out of alms to the poor. It is intriguing to imagine that in reading Ruskin, London found much that resonated with his own beliefs. London was an original thinker as well as a reader who absorbed the views of the philosophers and political scientists whose works he devoured. While we cannot say with certainty that Ruskin's writings influenced London, I think it is likely they did, even as London took exception to some of the specifics. I also think that, as he always did in his reading, London found beliefs and philosophies in Ruskin that accorded with and perhaps expanded on his own beliefs. The comparison of these two great minds is fascinating and encourages all of us to delve more deeply into the social issues that continue to resonate with us today. Thank you.
Sue, thank you so very much for a lovely rendition of your paper.
Oh, thank you.
I want to commend you in particular on two things before we start our discussion. I first was certainly one of those, as you say at the very beginning of your talk, who would have never put Jack London and John Ruskin in the same sentence.
Right.
And now I can, thank you to you. And your tremendous amount of work in bringing together the thinking of both of these people in a way that makes them more accessible to both of us. The second thing I want to commend you for is for bringing out so strongly at many points in your talk their deep humane concern for the plight of the poor and for people who are suffering so much in the England and the America of the day in which they wrote. That has essentially done something wonderful in terms of reminding us of still the great amounts of poverty that exist in both our societies, both in the UK and in the US. And you've done us a service by doing that. So thank you both for a new perspective, and thank you for the humane vision that you presented us with tonight.
Oh,
applause,
thank you.
Applause.
Oh, thank you, Jim. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed working on this. It was tremendously challenging. But you know, the first thing that tipped me off that there might be a connection was that quotation of Oscar Wilde that London used as the epigram to chapter 26 of The People of the Abyss. And then looking at London's copy of Wilde's The Soul of Man Under Socialism, and it was abundantly annotated, marked up like mad by London. So he clearly agreed with everything in it. It resonated with him. And then finding that Wilde looked up to Ruskin as a mentor, and with the bare beginnings of my neophyte's knowledge of Ruskin from the conference in 2019, I thought maybe there's something here, you know, maybe Ruskin handed down to Wilde, who handed down to London, or maybe Ruskin also went directly to London. So it just became a fascinating little avenue that I fortunately had the time that I could follow to its end and see what if anything it yielded.
Good, thank you. I think it's a new avenue for all of us. So I'd like to ask you maybe to begin the discussion. How is it that you really got interested in Jack London? We know that you got interested in Ruskin because of the conference that we had a number of years ago at the Huntington. But how is it you got interested in Jack London, and then you decided, okay, maybe I should do something to show the link between these two great thinkers?
Well, I got working on Jack London kind of through the back door. When I became the curator of literary manuscripts for the Huntington, I looked after Jack London's papers, and it turned out to dominate my everyday life because his papers were the most heavily used literary collection and had been for decades. And so I was constantly getting into the collection. It's a huge collection. It's very difficult. It's a complicated, very complicated collection. And it took me a long time to learn the collection to the point that I could really do a good job of helping researchers approach it and get what they needed from it. And in the course of that, I became intrigued. And then I began attending the symposia, the every 2-year symposia of the Jack London Society. And it just took off from there. And so I learned that there was so much more to Jack London than I had thought to begin with. You know, I read The Call of the Wild in junior high school, and I was too young for that. The cruelty to animals, the cruel things happening to animals were very difficult for me to read about. And that's kind of what I got out of it as a junior high student. So coming back to Jack London years later, reading The Call of the Wild again, which I love, it's a fabulous book, but finding out he did so much else. You know, he wrote The People of the Abyss, and he always said that was his favorite of all of his 50 books. The People of the Abyss was his favorite by far, but he wrote philosophy, psychology. He was into the psychology of the unconscious even before he read Carl Jung. And so he often was already there, and he would read these writers and it would resonate because he was already thinking these things. So he just became fascinating to me, and he's rewarded my interest multiple times over. It's just been a great kind of scholarly side thing. And now that I'm retired, I'm able to work on my own research full time, and I'm really loving every minute of that.
That's great. Does anybody else want to make a comment? Okay, I have a
Sue, thank
go
you
ahead,
for
go ahead, Gabe.
thank you again for the references to Wilde, particularly you're reading that marvelous letter. It's not as well known as it should be, where Wilde, in sending, I think, the copy of one of his children's stories to Ruskin, writes in it this wonderful thanks for their talks together and his sense of Ruskin as a source of such goodness in his own life. That there are fascinating connections between Wilde and Ruskin. Not only the obvious one of Ruskin's aesthetics having an influence on Wilde, and of course then Wilde taking his own tack later on with the art for art's sake movement and Pater and so forth. But the Soul of Man under Socialism is really, I think, an important connection that I know I hadn't made. That I think is again not as well noted as it should be.
Right. That letter from Wilde to Ruskin is just absolutely wonderful. It just, it sings with his affection for Ruskin and for what an important mentor Ruskin was for Wilde. And all that I was finding of their views on poverty and social reform, there's so much. I mean, what I was able to squeeze into this paper, the lecture, is one chip of the tip of the iceberg. There's so much more, and there's so much more depth to go into, but just wasn't time. But yeah, that connection from London to Wilde to Ruskin, I think that's a fascinating connection.
I think there's a book there, Sue.
Oh,
Wilde, London, and Ruskin. I wanted to ask you, we know that Wilde knew Ruskin, that he walked with him, that he talked with him, that he loved him. Do we know that London ever met Ruskin, attended any of his lectures when he was at Oxford?
No, they never met each other. And even though Wilde came on his American lecture tour, their paths never crossed. And what's interesting to me is that as a person, Wilde could not be more different from London. London is this macho, virile, adventuresome man, and of course Oscar Wilde was an aesthete. And they could not be more different, but they really come together on social reform and socialism. So that's a fascinating connection.
Yeah, well, you certainly taught me about what a great heart Jack London had and a concern for the poor. That's a great contribution of your talk tonight.
Well, thank you. London had a lot of depth, I think, and he had a gift for friendship. His friends all complimented him, saying that he had a gift for friendship, but he cared very deeply about people, and it grieved him to see people suffering and struggling. He had been there, although he did have a tendency to overstate how very poor they were. He would kind of overstate it because it was a little more dramatic that way. But there was no doubt that he and his family were poor, and he didn't have much. So he always took the part of people who were struggling because he'd been there.
In terms of this level of suffering, London had experienced it. Ruskin never had, but Ruskin saw it everywhere. In all the great cities of Europe that he visited, and he found it all abhorrent, as did London, as you pointed out in
Yes.
your comments. I want to ask you a question that occurred to me as I read your paper. As Ruskin neared the end of his life, he came to think that his life had been a great failure, that he had not done what he wanted to do, which was to change the world radically for the better. He had made some imprint on people in terms of art. He had made some people think about social issues, but he hadn't really turned things in another direction. So he thought of his life as a failure.
Mm.
Do you have any idea what Jack London thought of his life near the end in terms of his own ability to change the world in the direction he wanted to?
Mm. He didn't write or talk about that specifically, but he knew that he was a tremendously successful author. In The People of the Abyss, he tries to propose what might be done in society to alleviate the circumstances of the poor, but nothing was done. And I don't think he felt that he was a failure. I think he knew that it was a tough uphill battle. Now, just a few months before he died, he did resign from the Socialist Party because they weren't moving fast enough for his preference. He wanted them to go faster in making changes, but he felt that he was reaching an audience, but he knew it was a tough haul.
Interesting.
As it has proved to be.
Yes.
Ruskin himself was a profound anti-socialist, despite the fact that many people after him took him as sort of the voice of socialism,
Mhm.
but he was a profound anti-socialist. You mentioned along the way that he abhorred laissez-faire capitalism. I think that is true, but
Mhm.
he also believed that it was possible to have an honest and a true and a decent capitalism.
Yes.
And do you have it? What specifically did London write about capitalism and socialism? You wrote, I think you gave us one quotation about London talking about socialism. What else might you tell us?
Just that he was opposed to capitalism that carried greed with it and had the upper people stepping on the ones below them. He believed that all people should be equal. And he always looked for the common man and woman. So he thought that earning riches, untold riches, was really pretty evil. People shouldn't do that because I mean, I think, he wasn't far from Ruskin's belief that this is not the reason you do things in life. This is not the reason you produce and contribute in life. It's to live a good life, not to gather riches. That being said, London made a lot of money and he was well off. He knew that he needed to make money to support all of his other pursuits. He had a 14,000 acre ranch in California, and it cost him a lot of money to keep that going. So he wrote and wrote and wrote. He used to say that he was writing only to make money. Well, that wasn't true. He was doing a posture. He was posing. He couldn't not write. He had to write. But he knew he needed to make money, and he was able to make a lot of money. And he was never embarrassed or ashamed of that. He took a private Pullman car by train across country on a lecture trip, and all of his lectures were about socialism. And he didn't see that any disjunctiveness about that, which I think is interesting. But he always wrote and spoke in favor of socialism and of the common people. Hey, Oak?
Yeah, I would like to add a short comment. First of all, thanking you, Sue, for your help in my doing research on Jack London's writings and his collection at Huntington while I was writing my dissertation. London spent all of 3 months in Korea in 1904. I don't know how many people in America know that as a fact. He was commissioned to serve as a Russo-Japanese war correspondent for San Francisco Examiner in 1904. So he went to Korea in February and traveled through the peninsula up to Manchuria until the first part of May. And during that short stint that he had in Korea, he got to see all these poor people, poor peasants, poor laborers of Korea who were hired to transport for Japanese army as they transit through the peninsula all the way to Manchuria. And he saw how good-looking, healthy, well-built Koreans physically, but he also saw how depressed they were socially and how poor they were. I mean, he only saw the poor people because he followed the army alongside the coolies that he saw. He called the laborers who were helping the army, Japanese army, to transport war munitions and food and all that. So he wrote several articles in the paper and in his book about Korean, the poor of Korean. And that touched my heart very strongly. And I just wanted to mention that he not only saw, he compared the poor of the Korea to the East Enders in London. And that's something I didn't know until I read his articles and books.
That's a really good point to make, that he made that connection. Also, it reminds me that as a photographer, he took very sensitive portraits, especially of poor people. He was able to connect with them directly. He earned their trust, and so that they didn't mind being photographed. So he was good to people, and he was genuine, and he treated them absolutely honestly and openly. And some of there are I think 13 photo albums with his pictures from the Russo-Japanese War.
Right.
And a lot of those are portraits of just people he encountered in the city and town streets. And so he really had a genuineness about him. He really cared about people, and he encountered people as equals. You know, where he writes about his suit of used sailor's clothing in the East End of London, he liked that because it made him one of the people. He was no longer separate, and they looked at him and they didn't see someone who was on a higher social rung. They saw someone who was one of them, and he fit right in, and he could talk with them. And I should also mention that when he was in the East End of London, he was well aware that there was a certain falseness about his passing among the poor as one of them, because he had a little apartment, he had a little room he could go off to if things got really so bad that he couldn't stand it. He also sewed a shilling into the lining of his jacket in case of emergency. I don't think he doesn't ever mention that he used it, so I don't think he did. But toward the end of his time in the East End, he confessed to two guys that he struck up a friendship with. He told them who he was and what he was doing there, and they were completely on board. They didn't dislike him for it. They didn't think that he was a bad person. They really liked that he cared enough to be there, and that he could talk the talk. He'd lived the life that they were living, and so they still bonded with him. And I think that says a lot about his ability to reach out to people with a sense of humanity and with a sense of respect and dignity for the people that he meets. I've just had a question passed to me by hand by my other half, who's in the other room watching. That a friend of ours has asked a question. Jody asks, could Sue comment on how both Ruskin and London used visual art to depict the struggles people suffered? Well, I'm much more equipped to comment about London than I am Ruskin. And maybe I'll say a little bit and then ask Jim if he wants, or Jim or Gabriel or anyone else, to say more about Ruskin. Ruskin, of course, was talking about original works of art. He drew a lot of natural items. You know, he drew flowers and rocks and fields, and he was interested in architecture. He wasn't so much depicting people who were poor, not that I'm aware of anyway. Jack London, on the other hand, took photographs. He had a camera with him, and he would tramp through the East End of London with his camera and then leave it back in his little room when he wanted to go out and be with the people. So he took pictures. The 2 pictures that you saw that I included were pictures that Jack London captured with his own camera. And again, his ability to interact with people was quite remarkable. Ruskin was going at it a different way. It seems to me that he was looking at the aesthetics. He was looking at art and wanting to show art that could that people could bond with, and that they could that would resonate with people. And beyond that, I'm not really able to say. Maybe Gabriel or Jim could step in and answer that.
Go
Gabriel.
ahead, Gabe.
Yeah, just to comment, I think the main thing about Ruskin's art is to always understand that for him it was note-taking. In other words, he wasn't setting out, to be an artist in that sense. His art was really a record of his own seeing. So it was always directed towards the architectural detail that he was interested in, or the boulder that he was studying, or whatever it might be. It was a function of his personal seeing rather than a distinct artwork meant for public exhibition. So I think there's always that to remember about Ruskin's art. It was really a record of his own seeing. Although it's worth again noting that wonderful story when he was in Venice, when the Venetian authorities were demolishing many important medieval buildings in Venice to make way for the tourist trade and for pensions and for the whole tourist infrastructure. And Ruskin would arrange to draw these buildings so that aspects of these buildings so that unique architectural elements could be preserved, for the future, some unique capital or medallion or fresco. So that story of him up on a ladder trying desperately to sketch out a fresco cycle in an arcade before this building gets demolished by the authorities, and he's being bothered by all these urchins who come at him all day long begging for coins. And then he asks himself later, what does it mean that I can see the frescoes, but I cannot see the urchins?
So that's great. That's great.
Yeah.
And just thinking that all of his art is note-taking, what a phenomenal body of note-taking art he left. I mean, it's absolutely phenomenal, and it makes me think too of at the Huntington, the library has both the autographed manuscript and his art for his book, The 7 Lamps of Architecture.
Yes.
In these 2 fat volumes. And I always wanted to do an exhibition on Ruskin, and it just didn't work out. But the drawings, the architectural drawings he did are unbelievable. They are just incredible. The detail, they're magnificent.
Yes.
They're perfectly, beautifully done. And they just make you gasp. They're so beautiful. So what a talent. And just to think of all the
Ruskin always said that your art is a celebration of something that you love, something that you find in the world that you think is worthy of reproducing in such a way that others will begin to see it as well. And when you think of the body of his own work, and he never thought of himself as a very good artist, you think of the body of his work, whether he's trying to show us what a great cathedral, a portion of a great cathedral look like, or whether he's trying to show us what a flower in springtime looks like, or what the ocean looks like. They are all celebrations of parts of the natural world that he loved. And I think we miss part of Ruskin if we forget his tremendous love. Adoration is the word, I think. Adoration of nature and the importance of nature in our lives. I mean, in some fundamental way, he's always trying to bring us back to nature. He's trying to bring us back to sunsets and flowers and trees and even leaves. He's trying to show us how wonderful the world is in which we live. And you touched on it when you mentioned that great phrase of his, availing to life. A piece of work is wonderful when it avails towards life, when it brings people closer to the essence of life itself and infuses in them the spirit of life. That flows throughout all of Ruskin's work, from the first book of Modern Painters all the way to the end. What did Jack London think about nature? Did he write about nature? Did he think about nature? Did he ever do art?
He didn't do art, but he wrote and thought about nature a lot. There's a little category of his short stories and novels that are called, the Agrarian Stories. And so, for example, The Valley of the Moon is a novel he wrote late in his life, and it was set in California. And it was about a young couple who are very much Jack and his wife, Charmian London. And they're in Oakland, and they're living as work beasts, and they can't get ahead. And they decide, this is not right. We need to go back to nature. And so they take off on a walking trip, and they walk all around through Northern California, looking for the place where that they'll recognize, they'll know it's the right place, and they can live there, settle, and take up life, and live a much purer and better life than they could in Oakland, where they're beasts of industry. And so, I mean, it's a beautiful book in that way. And he wrote a short story called All Gold Canyon that has some of the most gorgeous descriptions of nature. And it talks about a prospector coming and destroying that because he's panning for gold, and he's got his pickaxe. But it begins with these paragraphs talking about just nature, with a deer that walks across the river and into the meadow. And it's just one of the most gorgeous descriptions. When he was buying the first piece of his ranch land, he rode his horse all through the Sonoma Mountains to choose the land, and recognized, like his characters in The Valley of the Moon, he recognized that land was where he needed to be. And he talks about seeing the madrones and all the trees and the bushes, and knowing this is where it is. This is where he needs to live. So absolutely, he was in tune with nature. So that's another link between London and Ruskin.
That's another chapter in your book.
Oh gosh.
Well, that taught me something right there that I didn't know about London, about his appreciation of nature. So
Right.
Good for you for recognizing that and bringing that out. You should put a paragraph or two of it in your paper.
I should. I didn't want to talk all night. So
Sue, I think it's fair to say, isn't it, that London's work can't be separated from whatever environment his characters are located in. You might want to say just a couple words about his premiere story, To Build a Fire,
yeah.
because the story would be meaningless without the physical setting.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you for asking that. Peter, Peter is my husband, by the way. Anyway, hi, Peter. He's in the other room. Absolutely. Yeah. London used his own experiences and his observations to kind of stoke the fire of his fiction. So his first stories were based in the Klondike, and To Build a Fire is one of his greatest stories, possibly the greatest. It's about a man who, against all wisdom and advice, sets out by himself walking, and it's well below zero. It's too cold. And everybody knows up there, you don't do that because you are not going to survive. And he knows this, and he just, oh, well, I know I'm going to be fine. And he goes ahead. Well, he doesn't make it, but he tries to build a fire, and he can't do it because it's like 75 below zero. He can't hold the matches, so he can't build a fire, and he ends up perishing in the snow and the cold. But absolutely, for London, the environment is everything for his stories. There's the Klondike. I mentioned his agrarian stories and books, which are mostly set in California. He also wrote a lot of stories that are based in the South Pacific, because of the Cruise of the Snark, that he went for a 1.5 year long voyage across the Pacific. He set a lot of his stories in the South Pacific, Hawaii, and other island chains. And they deal with the racism, they deal with the life, you know, the missionaries coming in, and the plantation owners, the slavers who were operating in the Solomon Islands. These all play a part in his novels and stories. So yeah, Peter, you're absolutely right. Poor Peter has lived with a lot of Jack London over the years. So he's a good sport.
Thank you, Peter.
Thank you.
In terms of the natural environment, I just want to mention this. Ruskin was so appalled at the destruction of the natural environment by the industrial age. That's one of the things that infuriated him the most in his later years, and was in my view, one of the primary things that led him to lose his mind. He just saw beautiful things being destroyed everywhere, natural things being destroyed, not only the buildings in Venice and other places, but nature itself being essentially raped and trodden as though it were nothing, as if it were useless. And so what you're telling us is that Jack London had a lot of that same sensibility.
He had a lot of it, yeah. He did embrace modern technology. He was always looking for what's new on the horizon. What's the latest thing that's emerging? What's the latest way of thinking? So, you know, he tried to farm using ecological principles that many of them he picked up in Korea when he was over there. He saw the levels on, you know, the plateaus on the hillsides, and knew that the farmers were using the ground, the earth, a lot more wisely than farmers in California were. But he also wanted to use modern knowledge, modern technology. He had an early form of a dictaphone that used a wax cylinder. And so he was always embracing the new, but he did love the earth, and he wanted to preserve the earth. Much in the nature of Ruskin, he was something of an ecologist. That would be another lecture or chapter, that the two of them loved ecology. They had that in common as well. They didn't want to see the despoiling of the land.
Gabriel, did you have some comments at the end? I know you have some announcements. Sue, I have to tell you, this has been a great hour and a half. It's been a delight to see you. It's been a wonderful thing to listen to and to read your research. I think you have something really important here. I guess my last question to you tonight would be, although I have about 6 others, my last question to you is, what will happen to this nice piece of work? Are you going to publish it?
I don't know. I don't know yet. We'll see.
I think you should.
That certainly is a definite possibility. Yeah.
Yeah. You've
Thank
worked
you.
We have
long
Thank
lots
you,
of
Jim.
fans here, right?
Oh, thank you. Thank you both so much.
Yeah, thank you too.
Oh, thank you.
That's one of the hard things about Zoom. You can't applaud properly.
I know.
Here we go.
And Sue, just a comment. Thank you for bringing up the Ruskin Club of San Francisco.
My pleasure.
Right. There once was a Ruskin Club in San Francisco, along with the Hillsdale Club, which is still in existence. As far as I know, the Ruskin Club in San Francisco went out of existence after the earthquake. You know, we don't hear
Oh,
of
is
it
that
again.
what happened?
I think so. As I hear about it, they didn't really even wrap up their affairs properly. They just
Oh
sort of
dear. Oh dear.
disappear after 1906.
Yeah, that's too
Yeah.
bad.
Yeah. But the Hillsdale Club in Berkeley is still around.
Oh, is it? Good.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. And of course, we're still around. Their Southern California counterpart.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Well, listen, again, as with everyone, you know, our special thanks for this informative and rich presentation. And we would all be urging you to carry this forward and find some way to make it this research, more available to the public. Because I think one of the things that is so important for our own programming in the Ruskin Art Club is to make these connections.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Not to see figures in isolation, but to see them as part of communities of
Mhm.
thought
Mhm.
and the way they influence and enrich and critique each other.
Mhm.
Is part of the discussion. We will be posting Sue's fine presentation on our YouTube channel very soon. It'll be a couple of days. So just go to our website, www.ruskinartclub.org, and click on the YouTube tab, and it will be there shortly. While you're enjoying revisiting Sue's lecture and recommending it to others, and looking at all the other dozens of presentations that we upload on the channel, all of our current programming, much of our kind of historic programming, be sure and subscribe. It makes YouTube happy. So when you go to the site, remember to subscribe. Also, of course, always great thanks to Jim Spates for being our moderator, and for Katrina Lau, our tech, for all of her help setting up this evening and putting up with us non-tech people as we try to navigate all these media. Quick announcement about our next program. Thursday, March 10th at 5 p.m., the usual time. We're very pleased. This has been years in the making. We are pleased to announce the inauguration of what we hope is an annual event, the Ada Louise Huxtable Lecture, co-sponsored by the Ruskin Art Club and the Getty Research Institute at the Getty Center in Brentwood. With the focus, as its namesake indicates, the great American architectural critic, Ada Louise Huxtable, on the subject, not surprisingly, of architecture. So this will be, as many of you remember, around this time last year, we had Norman Weiss and John Fiedler talking about architectural restoration as an issue. Wonderful program. So we're now sort of inaugurating this program around March, every year around the birthday of Ada Louise Huxtable, which is March 14th, that we will do an annual Ada Louise Huxtable lecture on architecture. As many of you, of course, know, Ruskin, in addition to being one of the first art critics, was also a major writer on architecture and a formative influence, to say the least, on 19th and 20th century architectural thought. Sue mentioned the drawings and the Seven Lamps of Architecture, the manuscript of which Huntington holds. So we're looking forward to adding this event to our annual repertoire. So our first Ada Louise Huxtable event will feature a conversation about the life and character and career of Huxtable herself, a conversation with Meredith Clausen, a professor of architectural history at the University of Washington, and Maristello Casciato, the senior curator and head of architecture special collections at the Getty Research Institute. So really a marvelous kind of send-off for this, hopefully this annual event. Details forthcoming on the website, so to take a look at those. And we will see you all next month. Good night.
Great. Thank you, Gabriel. So one other quick question. How is it that the Huntington got the London papers?
Oh, in the early 1920s, Charmian London, who lived many years beyond Jack's lifetime, was looking for a fire-safe place. She was worried about fire danger up in the Sonoma Valley. And so she was advised to approach Henry Huntington. And the first time she approached him, he said, "Oh, no, thanks, I don't think so." And she tried again a few years later. This time, he sent his librarian up to the ranch. And the librarian came back and said, "Mr. Huntington, we have to do this." So they started buying the manuscripts. And then from the 1920s all the way through, the last batch I got was in about 2010, both by gift and purchase from Charmian London and then from London's literary estate. All these things just kept rolling up there. So it just went on and on, but that's how it all began.
Great. And if you add Oscar Wilde into your mix, you've got a blockbuster.
Oh, yeah. You bet.
Always, always.
Okay.
Sue, thanks again.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you for letting me do this.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jim.
You're
Thank you,
welcome.
Gabriel. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Dr. Meyer.